Chapter 13. The Guild. Sade and Vondales were destitute again. Even the skiff they had stolen had been taken away. It was late afternoon and the dinner hour was upon them, an expanse of time yawning open and empty as their stomachs. Food, in the form of fish, was plentiful, piled in market stalls all around them, roasting over coals, dripping in oil, and tantalizingly out of reach. With no money and nothing to trade with, they were helpless. Sade thought of pilfering a loaf of bread or a wheel of cheese from a booth, but already he had a look of desperation and shopkeepers turned a close eye on him whenever he neared. As night fell, they found themselves beneath a pier, their stomachs painful as they searched for a place to sleep. The rocky shore was littered with empty mussel shells, fish bones, and lime peels. Crabs picked at the rotting carcass of a seal. They found a gap in the seawall where they huddled together, but the cold was unrelenting as the stone beneath them was hard. Vondales slept, for most of his weight was on Sade, but Sade, with the rock pressing beneath him and his limbs shaking from the chill, remained awake. Therefore, he heard the footsteps of boys approaching before he could see them. He hoped they would just pass by, even not notice them, but they instead made straight for the gap where he and his brother were hiding. There were 5 of them, their voices distinct with the nasal accent of the island. Their clothes were worn, the colors obscured by grime and the darkness. They gathered around Sade while Vondales slept. Sade would have moved, but his legs had gone numb from his brother's weight. A tall boy with greasy bangs stepped forward and spoke. "You need to come with us." Sade didn't move. He was not sure, with the pins and needles prickling his flesh, if he would even be able to stand up. He shook Vondales awake. His brother startled when he saw the other boys. It suddenly felt very crowded beneath the pier. "Get up, Vondales," Sade said. His brother complied and addressed the boy who had spoken. "Who are you?" "I'm Finn. We're from the Guild, and I'll say it once more. You need to come with us." Sade didn't know what the Guild was, but he had no reason to trust these boys. They had already been taken advantage of by Timos. "What if we don't want to?" Sade said, rubbing his legs, hoping that he would be able to spring up and run if needed. "It's not an invitation," a rotund boy said from the flank. He clicked the dagger on his belt in and out of his sheath. Sade flexed his thighs and straightened his knees. He might be able to get up, but not fight. Not yet, at least. His head was spinning from hunger or the potion Timos and his lady friends had given them. Sade studied the 5 boys, trying to take each one's measure. As if reading his mind, Finn spoke. "If we wanted you dead, you'd already be dead." "We don't have anything," Sade said, pulling his pockets inside out, hopeful that he could simply deflect their attention. "We know. You wouldn't be down here if you did." Finn's expression softened. "We can offer you a dry place, out of the damp, even something to eat, but you have to come now." Vondales looked at him expectant. The decision was Sade's. He looked at the rotund boy's dagger, the warm clothes on all of their backs, and their faces which were not drawn or narrow from hunger. Sensation returning to his legs, he said, "All right, we'll come." The boys led them through parts of the city they never would have ventured to on their own, through alleyways, under bridges, even through sewers. Just when Sade thought they were coming to a dead end, Finn would disappear down a broken grate, slip through a gap in the wall, or duck under a fence, and they would continue. Finding their way back along the path they had come was soon impossible. Sade instead tried to track landmarks, the position of the hills outside the city, the whereabouts of the moon, the placement of a silo. But even those landmarks proved useless when they ventured underground through a series of tunnels that carried water from the hills to flush away the refuse and waste of the city. In places, the stench of backed-up excrement was overwhelming, but in other tunnels, the water ran clear and swift. They made their way along the footpath that only allowed for them to walk single file. "When the rains came each year, the city used to flood until they built these tunnels," Finn explained. "The first series were not big enough, so they built underground reservoirs. One of them is blocked, and the Guild uses it as a shelter. The sheriff's men leave us be, as long as we keep the blockages out of the other tunnels. It's a sort of truce we have with them." "What is the Guild?" Sade asked. "You'll see," the rotund boy said. Finn felt no need to be so mysterious. "It's a band of us who live beneath the streets. Most of us runaways, orphans, and the like. If you want to thieve or beg on the streets, and if you are a runaway or orphan, you have to work with us. And if we don't, then you are our enemy. Enemies find it hard to do business. But Finn smiled. Life is tough on the streets. Why be enemies when together we can survive? They could hear the other children before they could see them. The chatter of voices, laughter, the occasional shout and cry drifted down along the tunnels. Sade was sure they would happen upon a crowd of them as they rounded each other. But the tunnels were deceptive and sound carried far. It was not until they made 3 more turns that a tunnel opened up into a large reservoir. Its sides were lined with bricks and air came from the grates that lined the ceiling of the wall to their left. Water gushed through the far wall. It had been mostly blocked with stones, sticks, and logs, so that the flow of water, which normally would have filled the reservoir, was reduced to a stream that bisected the room. In the dry spaces, the children had set up broken tables mended with driftwood, mismatched chairs, and sleeping mats made of dirty rags. It was a city of the discarded. Tattered curtains and moth-eaten tapestries from dead houses hung from the ceiling, providing privacy to a corner of the hall, where girls kept to themselves, studiously avoiding eye contact with the boys. They were youth of all ages, children who shouted and played, kicking a ball made of old sacks tied together with twine, the older boys who smoked pipes and even spoke to some of the more mature girls that mingled among them. Sade avoided looking at them, wary of what had happened the last time they had trusted young women. Finn led them to a circle of boys seated on the floor. There were boys drinking grog and picking at the bones of a chicken as they played dice. Younger girls, supervised by an older one who played dice with the boys, were picking up the empty plates and refilling mugs. The place felt like a cross between a tavern and an orphanage. One young man looked up from the game of dice and watched as they approached. His face was narrow. Around his neck dangled a number of necklaces made of shells, bones, and glass beads. Twine bracelets encircled his wrists. Without anyone telling him, Sade knew that this room belonged to him. This young man was seated in the center of the action, and yet was apart from it, his wide hazel eyes scanning back and forth from the game before him to the far dark corners. The other boys looked to him as they joked and jibed, as if waiting to take measure of his reaction. Even the servant girls refilled his mug first. As Finn brought them closer, his leader of the underworld stood up, unfolding long legs. He was nearly a man, with the first shadows of a beard darkening his jaw and chin in a comely way. He offered no smile or greeting as his eyes darted up and down Sade and Vondales. His expression did not betray what he might have thought. Underground royalty. Finn introduced him as Nicholas, and he was indeed the boy king of the underworld, leader of the guild, and, Sade knew, their only chance at survival. Sade dropped to his knees and pledged his allegiance to the guild immediately. Vondales followed. So began their time of thieving and begging, all of which was organized by the older boys and a few indomitable girls. Begging was hard, but thieving easy. Interestingly, there were 2 main methods used for thievery: out-and-out robbery, for which brawn and intimidation were required, or trickery, which took cunning. Vondales took to robbery well. Solid, compact, and fast, he could beat most of the other boys in fisticuffs and wrestling. An unsuspecting citizen stood no chance against him. Sade, on the other hand, excelled at the art of the scheme, which took more preparation but often yielded a greater reward. Sade and his brother were quick studies. They learned how to pick locks, pockets, and, importantly, how to profess innocence if caught. Sade could talk himself out of predicaments other boys could not, mainly as a result of his accent and the way his mother had raised them, making sure they spoke properly and correctly. When cornered and accused, Sade would convince adults that he lived a respectable life with a comfortable merchant family, except those times when they were caught red-handed, which often simply required flight and stamina to outrun their pursuers. Sade found the opportunities in the underside of the world were great. Men cheating on their wives with mistresses were good marks. Sade would steal into the windows of whorehouses and swipe a change purse right from a man's trousers hanging on a bedpost. In the dark, huffing, puffing, and sighing over one another, the adults would be none the wiser. Drunkards passed out on the street and groaning in the gutter made easy targets for pickpocketing. Men who gambled in the taverns could be distracted by girls, as he and his brother had been, when they were winning, and comforted by them when they were losing, all for a price. Sade, with his quick mind and knack for numbers, proved more effective at negotiating these transactions than other boys. Begging, which the younger boys and girls were made to do, was harder than thievery. Sade was too old anyway and lacked the required cuteness. If anything, over time his facial features had become hardened. His cheekbones were more pronounced, his lips thin and fine. These were the features of his mother, and they had made her exotic looking in her own time. But in the underworld they earned Sade the moniker of the Snake. With such a face, he was largely useless for begging. He was simply too intimidating, but he recognized the potential inherent in panhandling. He knew an opportunity when he saw it. The children put little thought into where they positioned themselves, except that they all crowded at busy corners, essentially competing with each other. Sade took it upon himself to learn the city, and with Nicholas's permission, spread the children out, concentrating them in richer neighborhoods. He tracked their earnings. The ones who did well he rewarded with food, but not so much that they ever grew fat and lost their stricken, starving, pathetic look. When a child's earnings dropped, Sade would move him or her to a new corner, unless they had become too old to beg, in which case the boys were taught how to steal, and the girls how to please men. The children with the most pleasant faces earned more, but not more than the lame ones. Lamed, scarred, beaten, and bruised children brought in the most coin. So much so that Sade had Vondales' blackened eyes, scratched faces, and split lips. Children would be compensated for the pain from their own increased earnings. So, they cooperated for the most part. Any who didn't found they were beaten more severely. Vondales grew to enjoy inflicting violence on his victims. It fed his confidence, which had been shattered since their own abandonment and maltreatment. To punish another was to be reassured of one's own power. So, it was with casual air that Sade suggested one day to Nicholas that they burn a boy. With permanent disfigurement, Sade calculated the boy would earn more. Nicholas, he had learned, was loyal to his subjects but not beyond cruelty. It did not take long to convert him, but it was impossible to find volunteers. Instead, they waited to find a runaway fresh off a boat, as Sade and Vondales had been. They pulled a similar trick on him to what Timos had played on them, except this time, the boy, Simon, was from the island of Cardiff. He was lured in by the promise of food, drugged, then his face disfigured with a hot iron. Nursing him back to health took some time, and of course at first he was reluctant to cooperate with those that had disfigured him. But alone, scared, and starving, he eventually acquiesced. Sade stationed him outside the Temple of Prayers, and Simon soon became the most productive boy in his stable. So productive that Sade improved upon the plan, cutting out the eyes of the next runaway boy they found. Blinded, he could not recognize that his rescuers were the same as those who had maimed him, and thus was much more cooperative. Practically cruelty, Sade called it, but it came with a price. Just as he had felt overwhelmed and vomited after killing his uncle, just as he has felt a strange sense of emptiness after running down the girl in Mornaport, each time they blinded a boy, sent the girl out with a man for the first time, Sade felt a sickness in the pit of his stomach. Some nights he had nightmares where they were on Skull Point again, cutting out the eyes of their own mother. He would awake in a cold, trembling sweat, but he swallowed the guilt and spoke of it to no one. Eventually it lessened. He willed it to, because he knew he had to survive. Survival is everything. Those with power survive. It was not long before there was an epidemic of blindness among the youngest of boys and some girls on the streets. Sade would organize them around the temple. He was not familiar with the island's religion, but he knew it paid. Or at least its worshippers did. Their only adversaries in the enterprise were the sheriff's men, and above them, the king's men. Armed like soldiers and clad with blue cloaks, they were the highest enforcers of the law on the island, and followed a chain of command directly to the king himself. Unlike sheriff's men, the king's men were not easily bribed. After all, it was the sheriff's men who tolerated the guild living in the sewers, so long as they cleared the occasional blockage and made sure that the bodies dumped there did not resurface. The King's men were different. Their prisoners never ended up missing or dead. Each received a trial and no bribe could free them. When they captured a boy for stealing, he was sent to an orphanage or, if his crime grievous enough, forced to work in a mine. They were thorough where the sheriff's men were lackadaisical, persistent where their lower counterparts were lazy. Something as petty as pickpocketing did not always attract their attention or resources, but maiming other children, and certainly murder, would. Sade and Vondales did what they could to avoid them. Any child in the guild knew that if they ever threatened to go to the King's men, they too would end up disappearing. Time passed. Seasons changed. Sade and Vondales' influence grew. Boys came to them for help, advice, even permission for new schemes. Soon, Sade and his brother took customary seats next to Nicholas. Vondales, quick, strong, menacing, on the boy king's left, a bodyguard of sorts, and Sade on his right, a counselor and captain. They had their share of grog, meat, and girls. They might not have been kings, but they were indeed princes. And so they were seated on Nicholas' left and right, a game of cards going on among them one evening, when some of the older boys dragged in Timos. Timos was taller, his hair longer, his boyishness being replaced by features that were more manly, a stronger chin, a feathering of whiskers above his lips and on his chin, and a more pronounced notch in his throat. His clothes were well made, not like a noble's, but close. Obviously, he lived a comfortable life and still did well for himself. Two larger and older boys, Carter and Andre, held him by either arm. He had not come willingly. His face was swollen, his shirt untucked, his collar turned upward, and the knees of his trousers ripped. Nicholas dropped his cards to the floor, pushed himself up, and clapped his hands on Timos' shoulder. Timos, still not paying your dues to the guild. I paid them already. 8 months ago, Nicholas said. The guild requires monthly fees to operate in our territory. I don't work in your territory. Everybody works in our territory. Maybe you didn't know, but we've grown. Timos looked at his feet, his hair falling across his face. In a small voice he asked, How much do you want? Before Timos could speak, Sade stood. Sir, a word. Nicholas turned from Timos, who did not even recognize Sade or his brother. Sade realized his heart was beating in his chest. Uncharacteristically, he stammered as he began to speak. This is the boy who deceived my brother and me when we first arrived. Nicholas turned his head, intrigued. Timos, do you recognize these young men? These friends of mine? Timos shook his head to see around the hair that had fallen across his face, looked at Sade and said, No, I don't recall him. How about the face of my brother? Sade asked, gesturing to Vondales, who sat coiled like a cat, ready to pounce. Or maybe you would recall what you took from us. Our money, our clothes, our books? Timos closed his eyes and sighed. Yes, I remember now. The books. Useless. We could barely give them away. Do you still have them? Sade stepped forward. His hands were shaking now, but he did not bother hiding it. The prospect of the power the books represented made his entire body feel light and charged. Timos nodded with vigor, sensing an opportunity to bargain. I sold one for its cover and used the pages of another for fire starting, but there is one I still have. Sade clenched his fist. At least there is still one. Sir, he said to Nicholas, I ask that we consider the property he stole from us when we assess his debts. Granted. Nicholas faced Timos, bending down to rub the patch of red fuzz on his chin. Oh, Timos, how the tables have turned. I'll return the book, as well as double the money you stole to make up for the ones you destroyed or sold. This in addition to the fees you owe the guild. Timos' lips whitened as he pressed them together in a frown, but Sade knew it was for show. He was still getting off lightly. I'll do it, he said, and I'll arrange to pay future fees. Nicholas brushed the hair out of Timos' face. That goes without saying. Of course, Timos swallowed. You have been very gracious. Does that mean I can go? A few of the boys in the circle of card players laughed. Nicholas looked at them askance and smiled. Timos, your debts are not yet paid. There are your penalties. You don't think I can let you go so easily? Not with so many of my own watching. What precedent would I be setting? Timos looked around, as if becoming aware of the 5 score children who had stopped whatever they were doing and were watching the drama unfold before them. A president of graciousness, sir? Timos croaked. Nicholas narrowed his eyes and said between clenched teeth, I am not gracious. Andre Carter, show him how gracious we are in the guild. The 2 boys on either side of Timos released him, and each made to strike. But living on the street by his wits and his own fist had made Timos quick and cunning. His previous show of weakness had been exaggerated, for he ducked one punch while reaching for Andre's belt and snatched his knife by the handle. He spun and caught Carter just before he lunged forward, slicing a rip in his sleeve and gash in his arm. Timos's feet were still in a fighting stance. The knife held out purposefully, not so far that he could not defend himself, not so close that he could not strike. Sade sensed those around him stiffening, reaching for their own blades and clubs, but they were slow, reluctant. It was clear Timos had training, the extent of which no one knew, and no one, not even Nicholas, was willing to engage him in one-to-one combat to find out. Except for Vondales. He stood up slowly, without a weapon, and stepped towards Timos. Vondales' eyes were unblinking, unmoving, even as he neared his adversary. He'd copied Timos' stance, extending a hand that was empty into the space between them. For an eternity, no one in the entire hall moved, spoke, or breathed. Then Vondales feinted an attack, and Timos swung the knife at his torso. Vondales caught Timos' wrist with a slap and clenched it in a vice-like grip. Timos' eyes widened with surprise, only to widen further when Vondales released him without taking the dagger. Sade's brother reset himself into a fighting stance, lifting his hands once more into the neutral zone between them. Except this time, he curled a single finger towards himself. Timos was breathing hard now, his chest rising and falling. His eyes darted for the nearest tunnel opening, his feet shifted. Vondales met his eyes and curled his finger again. This time, Timos struck, jabbing into Vondales' chest. Again, Vondales caught him by the wrist only to release him, leaving the knife in Timos' possession. Timos whipped his blade a 3rd time, slashing at the same hand Vondales had been catching him with, expecting it to come down again. But Vondales swept in the opposite arm and caught Timos once more. This time, the tendons in Vondales' wrist stood out, the pulse in his neck began to visibly beat, and his face turned red with exertion. While he squeezed Timos' forearm, Timos let out a small cry and dropped the knife. Vondales kicked it away, then turned Timos' arm against himself and made him punch his own face. The crowd laughed, but there was not a trace of mirth in Vondales. He took advantage of Timos while he was dazed, ripped his breeches down to his ankles, and then kicked him with such force between the legs that the gathered children gasped. Timos struggled for air and cried out. He fell to the floor only to have Vondales pick him up by the collar and strike him in the face with his knee. After 3 more such blows, a tooth dropped to the floor. When Vondales released him, Timos staggered, tripping on his breeches, and fell. He tried to crawl to safety, but Vondales dragged him by the ankle, drew him close, and began to kick him in his gut. Timos rolled, coughing and crying, his face dark and twisted in pain, his eyes squeezed to narrow slits, blood spraying out of his mouth with each strike. Vondales righted himself and sent another kick into the base of Timos' spine. His body arched backwards, and he wet himself. Hurt, humiliated, and defeated, Timos simply lay still, awaiting the next strike. Vondales provided it, stepping up to Timos' head, which he slammed against the stone floor with a stomp. He didn't stop. The chamber echoed with the thudding sound of Timos' skull on rock and his ragged breath. Sade, Nicholas said, his face pale. He's scared, Sade realized. Nicholas is scared. So was he of his own brother, even though he could draw a straight line from the bewildered boy who had wept at Skull Point to the person before him. Something had disappeared from his brother. Gone was the frightened boy who could not bring harm to his own sibling. He had been replaced by this young man who derived his worth, his power, from the harm he brought to others. Survival was everything. Those with power survive. Sade stood agog, bewildered at his own complicity in reshaping his brother. But without doubt, he knew that his brother's coldness, cruelty, and strength amounted to one thing: more power. So he waited a few more breaths, letting the echoes of Timos's head striking the stone travel throughout the chamber once more, just so all ears could hear, just so all could witness the ferocity in their midst. A ferocity I will have to contain. Sade stepped forward and called Vondales by name. His brother continued to hammer Timos with blows, unaware of his brother, unaware of the smallest children who were beginning to sob, unaware of Andre, who said in a low voice, "He's had enough." Sade came closer. Vondales' knuckles were dark with blood. Timos's face was unrecognizable. The floor was awash with urine, blood, and spit. Vondales moved without tiring, raining his hatred and vengeance on Timos, releasing a storm of pain and loss that had been years in the making. He had no comprehension that the mood of the room had shifted, that Timos was now viewed as the victim, with sympathy even. Another tooth rolled out onto the floor. Sade reached out and touched his brother's shoulder. "Vondales, it's me, your brother." For an instant, he knew his own brother did not recognize him as his eyes darted up and down Sade's breadth and width, assessing him as an opponent. But the demon that had taken over Vondales released its grip and his spirit returned. "Sade," Vondales said, his eyes clearing. "You've punished him enough now," Sade said. Vondales turned back to examine Timos with the detachment of a hunter who had just butchered his kill. "He stole your books." "He did. We'll get them back." "You said we should never be weak again." "I did. You've proven how strong we are." Vondales nodded, and strangely, beneath the bloody, strapping body of a young man, Sade could sense the young, scared boy again, eager to please and desperate to survive in a harsh world that Sade had spelled out the rules for. His brother had listened. Vondales let go of Timos's collar, and he slumped to the floor. The room relaxed, the spectators drawing in a collective breath. One of the older boys cracked a joke, but no one laughed. Some of the older girls rushed over to see Timos. Slowly, voices returned to the room, and an ordinary clamor resumed. Sade took a basin from one of the girls tending to Timos and began to wash Vondales' hands and face. Young children were staring. Older ones watched them out of the corners of their eyes. No one came close. No one dared, except for Nicholas. The fear had left him, and he looked upon Vondales like a proud father to his son. "Vondales, I know just the place for you," he said. "You are going to the fighting pits. We will make a fortune."